Margaret Rowley and Adrian Clarke were never meant to meet, one a wealthy art dealer's wife, trapped in a loveless marriage, the other a daring war photographer with a shadowy past, but their whirlwind affair would ignite a scandal so explosive it would end in betrayal, a missing masterpiece, and the mysterious disappearance that still haunts Britain. In the quiet English town of Canterbury, Margaret Rowley seemed to live a life pulled straight from the glossy pages of a society magazine. At 42, she was the sort of woman who turned heads without trying, graceful, self-assured, and always impeccably dressed. Her days were filled with the refined routines of an art dealer who had long mastered her craft. She curated private collections for wealthy clients, hosted gallery openings, and was often photographed smiling politely at charity dinners alongside her husband Thomas Rowley. To anyone looking in from the outside, theirs was a marriage of equals, two people of means and sophistication, bound together by decades of shared history. They traveled often, stayed in boutique hotels in Paris, sipped wine in Tuscany, and seemed to glide through life with enviable ease. But behind the perfectly arranged surface, things were different. Margaret had started to feel something she could barely admit even to herself, a dull ache, a quiet but persistent restlessness that grew heavier with each passing year. It wasn't that she disliked Thomas. He was, in his way, kind and reliable. But their connection had thinned over time, worn down by unspoken silences and separate lives lived under the same roof. Thomas spent hours poring over investment reports, checking market updates late into the night, his mind tethered to numbers and profit margins. The attention he once gave her had shifted to his financial portfolio, and Margaret's presence in the house had become as familiar and overlooked as the antique furniture they had collected over the years. The signs of her dissatisfaction were subtle at first. She started staying out later, after work, claiming late gallery meetings or last-minute client appointments. She booked solo trips to London under the guise of sourcing new art, and lingered in cafes for hours, watching strangers pass by. She invested in new dresses, took greater care with her makeup, and cut her hair into a sleek style that drew compliments from acquaintances but none from Thomas. He seemed not to notice, or perhaps chose not to. Friends still envied her, of course. They saw the champagne toasts, the well-kept garden behind their Georgian townhouse, the way she and Thomas stood together in photographs, smiling in perfect unison. They didn't see the mornings when they barely spoke over breakfast, or the nights Margaret lay awake listening to the ticking of the old clock in the hallway and wondering if this was all her life would ever be. In moments of private reflection, she told herself she should be grateful. Many people would give anything for the comfort, stability, and wealth she had. But gratitude was no match for the gnawing sense that something vital was missing. A sense of being truly seen, truly alive. It was a dangerous feeling, though she didn't yet realize it. She only knew she wanted more, even if she couldn't yet imagine what more might look like. She couldn't have known that the first step toward finding it would also be the first step toward losing everything. It was on a crisp October evening in London that Margaret's life began to take a turn she could never have predicted. She had traveled to the city for a private art exhibition at a converted warehouse in Shoreditch, one of those exclusive events where the lighting was low, the champagne flowed freely, and conversations hummed in a dozen different accents. Margaret moved easily through such gatherings, her presence polished and assured. But that night, something felt different. Perhaps it was the electric energy in the air, or perhaps it was simply that she was ready for something, though she didn't yet know what. She noticed him almost immediately. Adrian Clarke was standing near a large black and white photograph of a ruined village in Syria, a camera hanging loosely around his neck. He was younger than most of the patrons, mid-30s, lean, with a rugged face that seemed carved from hardship. His hair was dark, slightly unkempt, and his clothes were casual in a way that felt deliberate, as if to remind the viewer that he was not like the men in tailored suits scattered around the room. He was the kind of man who carried his own weather, and Margaret, without understanding why, found herself drawn toward him. Their first conversation was brief, but it stayed with her long after she left. He spoke about his work as a war photographer with a calm intensity, describing the moments between chaos that no one else bothered to capture. There was something both dangerous and magnetic in the way he looked at her, not with polite detachment, but as though he had already guessed her private thoughts. He asked nothing about her husband, nothing about her life in Canterbury. Instead, he spoke as though the only thing that mattered was the moment they were sharing. Over the following weeks, she saw him again and again. At first, their meetings were casual: coffee after an exhibition, lunch in small cafes tucked down quiet streets. But there was always a tension between them, a current that made the air feel charged. Adrian would tell her stories about his travels, the people he had met, the conflicts he had documented. His words painted a world far removed from hers, a world of danger, beauty and moral complexity. She began to crave these encounters, marking them on her calendar like secret celebrations. Soon, they slipped beyond the bounds of polite friendship. A weekend trip to the coast, under the guise of a professional collaboration to photograph an old manor for an art project, turned into long hours in each other's company, walking along the windswept beach, sharing wine in a small rented apartment. Margaret felt herself awakening in ways she hadn't experienced in years. Adrian made her feel visible again, wanted, exciting, necessary. But beneath his charm, there was an edge she chose not to examine too closely. He never seemed to speak much about his own past, unless it was to impress her with a story of danger or resilience. His career, he admitted, was unpredictable and financially unstable. He made light of it, calling himself a romantic with a camera and no fixed address. But Margaret noticed the way his eyes sharpened when she mentioned her work or hinted at the wealth that her marriage provided. Still, she ignored the warning signs. In her mind, Adrian represented freedom, the life she could have if she broke away from the slow suffocation of Canterbury. She began moving money around, small amounts at first, to help fund his upcoming photography trips. It felt harmless, almost noble, as though she were sponsoring great art. What she didn't realize then was that Adrian's interest in her was not only born of attraction. Behind the warmth in his smile and the steady weight of his gaze, there was calculation. He had recognized something in her, a vulnerability, a hunger that could be shaped into opportunity. Margaret was falling in love, but Adrian had already begun to think of her as part of a larger plan, and it was a plan that, once set in motion, would consume them both. Margaret's involvement with Adrian deepened quickly, and with it came a slow but deliberate erosion of the boundaries she once held. At first, she told herself she was simply supporting his work, a patron of the arts helping a gifted photographer bring untold stories to the world. She transferred a few £1,000s to cover travel expenses for an assignment in Morocco, and when he returned with hauntingly beautiful images, she felt justified in her generosity. But soon, the sums grew larger, and the transfers became more frequent. She kept these payments hidden from Thomas, carefully disguising the withdrawals so they looked like legitimate business expenses for her gallery. It felt like a harmless secret, at least at the start. Adrian had a way of presenting his ideas as if they were inevitabilities rather than suggestions. He spoke about the instability of his income and the limitations of chasing commissions from editors who cared more about profit than truth. Then one evening, in the warmth of a dimly lit apartment they had rented in Brighton, he began to outline a vision for their future. It wasn't just talk of love or passion. It was concrete, calculated. They could leave Britain entirely, he said. Start over in a place where no one knew them. He painted vivid images of a life together in Greece, with its turquoise waters and whitewashed houses. A home filled with light and space, far removed from the quiet confinement of Canterbury. To make this vision a reality, he explained, they would need money, more than she could withdraw from her accounts without arousing suspicion. And then he mentioned the Rowley collection. Among Thomas's prized possessions was a rare oil painting known as Victory of Love, a late 19th century masterpiece that had once hung in a Parisian salon. Its provenance was impeccable, and its estimated value exceeded £2 million. Selling it quietly, without going through the usual channels, could provide them with enough to disappear and live comfortably for years. Margaret recoiled at first. The painting wasn't hers to sell, and the idea of taking something so valuable from her husband felt like crossing an invisible line she had never dared approach. But Adrian spoke with a persuasive certainty that made her resistance feel almost childish. He reminded her that Thomas barely noticed her anymore, that their marriage had become a polite performance for the outside world. Was it really a betrayal? He asked. If the relationship was already hollow, he told her the painting deserved to be appreciated by someone who understood its beauty, not locked away in a private gallery like a trophy. In the weeks that followed, the idea took root in Margaret's mind. She began to imagine the liberation of leaving everything behind. No more stiff charity galas, no more cold silences at breakfast, no more feeling invisible in her own home. The painting, she thought, could be her ticket out. She told herself it wasn't theft, not really, it was an exchange. The end of a loveless life for the beginning of something new. They began to plan in detail. Adrian knew a discreet buyer overseas who could arrange for the painting to be moved out of the country without attracting attention. Margaret would wait for a night when Thomas was away on business, then remove the painting from its locked frame in the private gallery. They would make it look like a break-in smashed glass, a forced window, a few items tossed around for realism. Margaret knew the plan was dangerous, but she was intoxicated by the sense of purpose it gave her. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was moving towards something rather than merely existing. What she could not yet see was that she was also moving toward a precipice, and once she stepped over, there would be no way back. The night of the theft arrived under a curtain of relentless November rain, the kind that blurred the edges of the world and muffled every sound. Thomas was away in Edinburgh for a financial conference, and the house was unusually still. Margaret moved through it with deliberate calm, though her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had rehearsed every step in her mind for weeks, telling herself that precision would keep her safe. The tools she needed, a small flathead screwdriver, a pair of cotton gloves, and the keys to the private gallery, were laid out in the kitchen drawer. She unlocked the gallery and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of polished wood and the soft hum of the temperature control system. The walls glowed faintly under the low lights, each painting a frozen moment in time, but her eyes went straight to Victory of Love, framed in ornate gilt, its colors warm even in the dimness. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, feeling both awe and guilt. This was the object that would sever her old life from her new one. The act itself was almost anticlimactic. She loosened the screws holding the frame, carefully lifted the canvas free, and slid it into the protective wrapping Adrian had given her. She had expected her hands to shake, but they moved with surprising steadiness. She placed the empty frame back on the wall, scattering a few items across the floor to simulate chaos. At the window, she used the screwdriver to pry the latch, leaving clear signs of forced entry. The scene was convincing. It looked like the work of a professional burglar. By midnight, the painting was in the boot of her car, and she was driving through the rain to the meeting point Adrian had chosen, a deserted lay-by just outside Dover. He was waiting when she arrived, his silhouette illuminated briefly by the sweep of her headlights. He took the painting without sentiment, tucking it into the back of his own car. There was no kiss, no words of reassurance, only a curt nod before he drove off into the wet darkness. Margaret told herself it was because he was being cautious, that once the painting was secure, everything would fall into place. She returned home in the early hours, soaked through, and went straight to bed without undressing. The next morning, she made the call to the police, her voice trembling in what sounded like shock. Officers arrived within the hour, photographing the supposed point of entry, dusting for fingerprints, and taking her statement. She played the role of the devastated victim, recounting how she had discovered the gallery in disarray. The investigation began quickly, but Margaret was reassured by Adrian's confidence. He had assured her the buyer would move the painting out of Britain within days, making it nearly impossible to trace. For a short while she felt almost exhilarated. She had crossed the line, and nothing terrible had happened yet. That feeling didn't last. 2 days after the theft, Adrian stopped answering her calls. At first, she told herself it was just a precaution, that he was lying low until the heat died down. But then she went to his flat in London and found it stripped bare. No clothes, no photographs, no sign he had ever lived there. Panic began to gnaw at her. 3 days later, the police contacted her with news. Adrian's car had been found abandoned in a remote field outside Dover. Inside were faint traces of blood on the driver's seat and an unmarked envelope containing several candid photographs of Margaret, images she had no memory of being taken. What had begun as a calculated escape from her life was now sliding rapidly into something darker, something she could no longer control. Margaret sat in the drawing room of her Canterbury home, staring at the rain trickling down the windows, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The police visit earlier that day had left her shaken in a way she couldn't quite explain. The photographs found in Adrian's abandoned car disturbed her more than the traces of blood. They were intimate but unsettling, taken at moments she hadn't even noticed he was watching. One showed her walking through a crowded market in London, another captured her sipping wine alone on a balcony, and yet another was a blurred image of her sleeping, the curve of her shoulder just visible above the sheets. Whoever had taken them had done so without her knowledge, and the implication was inescapable. Adrian had been watching her far longer and far more closely than she had ever realized. The detectives' questions were growing sharper. They wanted to know how well she knew Adrian, how she had met him, and why he had her photographs. Margaret gave careful, measured answers, sticking to the version of events she had prepared. He was an artist she had worked with. She knew little of his personal life, and she was as shocked as anyone by his disappearance. But the calm she tried to project was eroding. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. 2 days later, her unease deepened. The police revealed more about Adrian's past, details she had never heard from him. He had a record of fraud in 3 different countries, though none of the cases had led to convictions. There were whispers of other wealthy women who had supported him financially before he vanished from their lives without warning. In one case, a woman in Lisbon claimed to have lost her family home after taking out loans on his behalf. Margaret tried to dismiss these stories as rumors or exaggerations, but they burrowed into her thoughts like splinters. Then came the most devastating revelation. Thomas had known about the affair for months. A detective, perhaps testing her reaction, mentioned that her husband had hired a private investigator to follow her. Every meeting with Adrian, every weekend trip, every unexplained withdrawal, it was all documented in photographs and reports. Thomas had even been given a full dossier on Adrian's background before the theft took place. Margaret felt her chest tighten as she pieced it together. Thomas had confronted Adrian just 2 days before the so-called break-in. The police wouldn't say much about that meeting, only that it had been heated. Adrian had left visibly shaken, according to a witness, and had not been seen publicly after that. The press caught wind of the story and pounced. Headlines in bold type appeared in every paper. The victory of love scandal, millionaire's wife in art heist affair, mystery lover missing. Her photograph was splashed across the tabloids, often paired with older pictures of her and Thomas smiling together at charity galas. Strangers began recognizing her in the street, some muttering insults under their breath, others staring with thinly veiled curiosity. Margaret found herself trapped in a tightening vice. She was still a suspect in the theft of the painting, now compounded by insinuations that she might have had a role in Adrian's disappearance. She clung to the hope that he would resurface and explain everything, clearing her name. But as the days passed and no trace of him was found, that hope began to rot. She thought often of the painting itself, Victory of Love, and how its name now felt bitterly ironic. It had been meant to symbolize her escape, her new beginning. Instead, it had become the centerpiece of a scandal that was destroying her reputation and pulling her deeper into a story she no longer understood. Somewhere in the shadows of this mess lay the truth, but the more she learned, the more she feared that the truth would be worse than anything she had imagined. When the police summoned Thomas for further questioning, Margaret expected him to handle it with his usual composure, the calm and calculating manner that had always made him seem untouchable. But when he returned home that evening, Something in his face was different. His jaw was tight, his eyes unsettled. 2 days later, detectives arrived at the Rowley house and informed her that her husband had given them a new statement, one that shifted the entire investigation in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Thomas admitted that on the night Adrian vanished, he had followed him. After their confrontation 2 days earlier, Thomas claimed he had been unable to let it go. He wanted to look the man in the eye again, to see if intimidation alone could end the affair and keep his marriage intact, or perhaps simply to satisfy his own anger. His version of events was delivered with an almost clinical precision. He had trailed Adrian's car from London to a remote area near Dover, where Adrian pulled over on the side of a narrow, unlit road. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in a burst of rage, Thomas struck him. Adrian fell, hit his head and bled. Thomas admitted he panicked, leaving Adrian in the cold rain, assuming he would regain consciousness and find his way to safety. But when Thomas returned hours later, his guilt gnawing at him, the roadside was empty. The car was still there, its driver's seat stained, but Adrian was gone. Thomas swore he had no idea what happened next. He insisted he had not killed him, had not moved a body, had not hidden anything. The admission was damning enough to draw a wave of public outrage, but without a body or further evidence, the police were left with more questions than answers. The case only grew murkier. Some detectives theorized that Adrian, injured but alive, had taken the opportunity to vanish entirely, using the chaos to escape both Thomas and the law. Others suspected that someone else might have been involved, a third party who had reasons of their own to ensure Adrian disappeared for good. The possibility that Adrian had the painting with him when he vanished complicated matters further. For Margaret, the revelations were shattering. She had entered this web willingly, thinking she was pursuing freedom and love, only to discover she was a pawn in a far larger and more dangerous game. Her relationship with Thomas became a tense standoff. He spoke little to her now, and when he did, it was with a sharpness that made clear he saw her not as a wife, but as the person who had invited this disaster into their lives. Months later, with no sign of Adrian and the painting still missing, the authorities turned their focus back to her. Investigators uncovered evidence of the bank transfers she had made to Adrian, the lies she had told about her whereabouts, and the inconsistencies in her account of the night of the theft. While there was insufficient proof to link her to Adrian's disappearance, the financial records and false statements were enough. She was charged with art fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and money laundering. Margaret's trial drew crowds, the press treating it like a theater performance. Every detail of her life was dissected, every expression analyzed. When the verdict came, she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As she was led away, the flashbulbs of photographers burst like lightning, capturing her final moments of freedom. To this day, the fate of Adrian Clarke remains unsolved. Some claim to have seen him in Spain, or France, or on a Greek island, always just beyond the reach of the law. Others believe Thomas's temper had ended his life that night in Dover, and somewhere, perhaps locked away in a private collection or hanging on the wall of an anonymous villa, Victory of Love waits in silence, its beauty forever tied to a scandal that left behind nothing but questions, betrayal, and the hollow echo of promises that were never meant to last.